Right now, the United States and Iran are in direct talks in Islamabad, Pakistan, under a fragile ceasefire that followed weeks of conflict and disruption across the region. According to current reporting, this is one of the most significant known moments of direct contact between the two sides in decades, and it comes at a time when military pressure, diplomacy, and energy security are all colliding at once. What makes this important is that the issue goes far beyond one meeting room or one temporary pause in fighting. At the center of the crisis is the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important shipping routes in the world, where access, deterrence, and leverage now matter as much as diplomacy itself. The United States wants maritime traffic restored and regional pressure contained. Iran is trying to negotiate from a position that protects its security interests, its finances, and its regional standing. So the real question is not simply whether these talks produce calm in the short term. It is whether they can define the terms of de-escalation before military pressure returns, markets react again, and the wider region moves back toward instability. The reason these talks are happening now is that the crisis has already reached the point where military pressure and economic disruption are feeding into each other. Over the past 6 weeks, the conflict has shaken regional stability and pushed the Strait of Hormuz to the center of global attention, because even limited disruption there affects oil flows, shipping confidence, and energy pricing far beyond the Middle East. According to current reporting, that is the immediate backdrop to the meeting in Islamabad. Pakistan then became important because it helped create the diplomatic opening. Reuters and AP report that Islamabad played a role in brokering the current 2-week ceasefire and is now hosting the talks as both sides test whether that pause can be turned into something more durable. That makes the ceasefire less like a final settlement and more like a narrow window in which both governments are trying to secure better terms before pressure builds again. What gives this meeting extra weight is the level of contact. These talks are being described in current reporting as the highest-level direct U.S.-Iran engagement in decades, with senior officials meeting face-to-face under active regional tension. So this is not just another diplomatic exchange. It is a sign that both sides see enough risk in continued escalation to at least test whether direct negotiation can produce a controlled form of de-escalation. At this stage, the goal is not to overwhelm the viewer with the full historical backstory. The key point is simpler. Weeks of conflict created enough military, economic, and political pressure that both sides have now entered a rare direct channel, and Pakistan is the country trying to hold that channel open. But if the talks are happening now, the next question is why Pakistan, of all places, became the venue. Pakistan matters here because it is doing more than providing a hotel and a secure room. According to current reporting, Pakistan helped keep the ceasefire effort from collapsing earlier in the week, and is now mediating the talks themselves. That gives Islamabad a real role in the process, not just a ceremonial one. In practical terms, Pakistan is trying to keep both sides engaged long enough to test whether a temporary pause can become a more structured de-escalation. The location also makes strategic sense. Islamabad is outside the Gulf, which lowers some of the immediate regional pressure around the talks, but it is still close enough to the crisis that Pakistan can present itself as a relevant regional actor rather than a distant bystander. Reuters notes that Pakistan hopes to strengthen its image as a mediator, and the choice of a heavily secured venue in the capital shows that the setting was chosen with both political sensitivity and operational control in mind. That means the geography of diplomacy is part of the story. Where talks happen can affect who has access, who shapes the agenda, and who gains influence from the process. There is also a broader diplomatic layer. AP reports that officials from China, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar are observing the process in some form, which shows that these talks sit at the intersection of regional security, energy transit, and wider power politics. From Pakistan's perspective, that creates an opening. If it can help manage even a limited diplomatic breakthrough, it strengthens its standing at a moment when Gulf security, trade routes, and external influence are all overlapping. So Islamabad is not just the backdrop, it is part of the mechanism holding this fragile process together. But the venue is only one layer. The real center of gravity is not Islamabad, it's the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is the real center of this crisis because it connects a regional conflict to the wider global economy. A lot of geopolitical stories stay regional. This one does not. When Hormuz is under pressure, the consequences move quickly into oil markets, shipping schedules, insurance pricing, and inflation expectations in countries far from the Gulf. That is why this waterway matters more than the meeting venue itself. It is the point where diplomacy, naval posture, and global trade all meet. The scale is what makes it so important. The U.S. Energy Information Administration says that in the first half of 2025, about 20.9 million barrels per day moved through the Strait of Hormuz, equal to roughly 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption. The same EIA analysis says more than one-fifth of global LNG trade also passed through this route. In simple terms, this is not just an oil corridor for the Gulf. It is one of the world's most important energy choke points, and any disruption there immediately becomes a global problem. That is why the current talks matter so much. Reuters reports that the strait remains one of the main points of disagreement in the Islamabad negotiations. The U.S. side is focused on restoring free passage for global shipping, while Iran is treating Hormuz as a key source of leverage inside the talks. That tells you something important about the structure of the crisis. This is not only a diplomatic dispute. It is also a contest over access, control, and the rules of movement through a route the global economy depends on. And once traffic through Hormuz becomes uncertain, the disruption spreads beyond energy producers. Reuters reports that Iran's blockade of the strait disrupted global energy supplies and pushed oil prices sharply higher. It also notes that the wider disruption has fed inflation and slowed the global economy, with effects expected to last for months, even if negotiators succeed in reopening the route. So the issue is not only whether oil can eventually move again, it is whether markets, insurers, ship owners, and cargo operators trust the route enough to use it normally. That confidence has already been damaged. Reuters reported in March that maritime war risk insurance premiums surged, in some cases by more than 1,000%, as the conflict widened around Hormuz. Even now, Reuters says 3 supertankers appear to have passed through the strait for the first time since the ceasefire, which is a sign of limited movement, but not yet a return to normal conditions. So when people ask why this crisis matters globally, this is the answer. Hormuz is where a regional war turns into a worldwide economic risk. If Hormuz is the economic center of the crisis, then the next question is simple. What does each side actually want from these talks? What Washington wants, at a minimum, is fairly clear in current reporting. Reuters says the U.S. position centers on restoring free passage for global shipping through the Strait of Hormuz and constraining Iran's nuclear program so it cannot move toward a weapon. AP also reports that the U.S. proposal includes reopening the strait and restricting Iran's nuclear activities. So from Washington's perspective, these talks are not only about stopping the current crisis, they are about re-establishing maritime access and reducing the risk that a temporary ceasefire leaves the core security problem unresolved. Tehran's position is different. Reuters reports that Iran is demanding the release of frozen assets, control over terms around the Strait of Hormuz, war reparations, and a ceasefire that extends beyond the immediate U.S.-Iran track, including Lebanon. AP similarly says Iran presented what it called red lines, including compensation for damage from the war, the release of frozen assets, and a guaranteed end to the conflict on terms it can justify at home. In other words, Iran is not approaching these talks simply as a technical maritime negotiation. It is trying to turn military resilience and control over a choke point into political and financial gains. That is why the gap between the two sides remains so important. One example is sequencing. Reuters reports that before the talks began, an Iranian source said the U.S. had agreed to release frozen assets, but a U.S. official denied that. That kind of contradiction matters because it suggests the two sides are still far apart, not just on outcomes, but on what has or has not already been conceded. The result is that these are peace talks in name, but in practice they look more like a bargaining contest over access, sanctions, compensation, and the order in which any deal would be implemented. And that leads to the harder question. What leverage does each side still have while the talks are taking place? While the talks are underway in Islamabad, neither side is negotiating from a position of full calm. Reuters reports that the U.S. military has already begun setting conditions to clear mines from the Strait of Hormuz, with American warships moving through the waterway as part of a broader effort to restore safer passage for commercial traffic. From Washington's perspective, that is more than a technical mission. It is a signal that the United States is prepared to back diplomacy with maritime operations designed to reopen a route the global economy depends on. Iran, however, still holds real leverage even while these talks continue. The reason is simple. It does not need a full shutdown of Hormuz to create pressure. Reuters reports that shipping through the strait had fallen to less than 10% of normal levels earlier this week, and even after the ceasefire, only limited tanker movement has resumed. That kind of disruption affects confidence immediately. Ship owners, insurers, and energy traders do not wait for a formal breakdown in diplomacy. They respond to uncertainty, and uncertainty itself becomes part of Iran's bargaining power. This is what makes the current moment strategically important. Diplomacy and signaling are happening at the same time. The U.S. is showing it can help reopen the route. Iran is showing that even partial restrictions can still impose economic costs and complicate commercial movement. Reuters also reports that the strait remains one of the main sticking points in the negotiations, which means both sides are still trying to shape the terms of access rather than simply agreeing on them. So these talks are not taking place in a quiet diplomatic vacuum. They are happening under active pressure, with each side trying to improve its position while the ceasefire still holds. And that creates the next issue. Even before a deal is signed, delayed, or rejected, markets and shipping companies have to make decisions in real time. So what has the crisis already changed economically? The economic impact of this crisis is where the broader strategic picture becomes easiest to measure. Even before any lasting agreement is reached, the disruption has already moved into oil prices, shipping decisions, insurance costs, and supply chain planning. Reuters reported that the conflict tightened physical crude markets and pushed prices sharply higher, with Brent settling at $95.20 and U.S. crude at $96.57 on April 10th, even after some easing from earlier highs. That tells you the market is not pricing in a clean resolution. It is pricing in continued uncertainty around supply, transit, and the durability of the ceasefire. Shipping costs have also changed in a way that matters beyond the Gulf. Reuters reported that war risk insurance premiums surged by more than 1,000% in some cases after the conflict widened, sharply increasing the cost of moving cargo through the region. When that happens, the effect is not limited to oil producers. It changes tanker economics, raises freight costs, complicates cargo planning, and forces traders and shipping firms to rethink routes and timing. In other words, even partial disruption in Hormuz creates costs long before a route is fully closed. That slower, less visible part of the story is confidence. Hapag-Lloyd said it would still take 6 to 8 weeks for shipping to return to normal, even after stabilization, and estimated the crisis was costing the company around $50 million to $60 million per week. That is a useful reminder that reopening a route is not the same as normalizing trade. Ships may begin moving again, but insurers, operators, and customers need time before they treat the corridor as reliable at scale. So this section of the story is not just about prices going up or down on a given day. It is about how a geopolitical confrontation turns into a chain of real-world costs: higher insurance, delayed cargo, tighter energy markets, and slower recovery even after diplomacy begins. And that matters because this is no longer just a US-Iran issue. Other states now have a direct stake in the outcome. By this point, the story is already bigger than Washington and Tehran. AP reports that officials from China, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar are observing or helping shape the diplomatic environment around the Islamabad talks, which tells you these negotiations are no longer a narrow bilateral issue. For Gulf states in particular, the outcome matters because their security, export routes, and regional balance all depend on whether this ceasefire holds and whether shipping through Hormuz can normalize. Pakistan may be hosting the talks, but the audience is much larger. China's interest is especially easy to understand when you look at the energy map. The U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates that in 2024, about 84% of the crude oil and condensate moving through the Strait of Hormuz went to Asian markets, along with 83% of the LNG that passed through the strait. China, India, Japan, and South Korea were the main destinations. That means Asian economies are the most exposed to any disruption, whether the problem is a full blockage, limited traffic, or simply higher insurance and freight costs. That changes the meaning of the crisis. It is not only about regional security in the Gulf, it is also about broader energy security, trade stability, and alignment politics across Asia and the Middle East. If shipping through Hormuz remains uncertain, countries far beyond the immediate conflict zone have to adjust energy purchases, pricing expectations, and diplomatic positioning. In that sense, the Islamabad talks are being watched not just as a peace effort, but as a test of whether a vital global choke point can be stabilized without another round of escalation. So with all of these pressures in play, what are the most realistic paths from here? From here, the most realistic first scenario is a narrow, transactional de-escalation. In that outcome, both sides avoid trying to solve every dispute at once, and instead focus on limited practical steps. Some restoration of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, some temporary understandings on access and pressure, and an agreement to keep talking. That fits the current moment because Reuters and AP both describe the ceasefire as fragile but still active, with direct talks underway in Islamabad and at least some tanker movement beginning to resume. This would not amount to a full settlement. It would be a limited arrangement designed to reduce immediate risk and buy time. The second scenario is that the talks continue, but without a real breakthrough. That may be the most plausible middle path if the two sides remain too far apart on sanctions, frozen assets, maritime access, and nuclear limits, but still judge renewed escalation to be too costly right now. Reuters reports that the two sides are already disputing basic points, such as whether any Iranian funds will actually be unfrozen, which suggests the gap is not only political but procedural as well. In that kind of outcome, the ceasefire could hold loosely, shipping might resume only partially, and both sides would preserve leverage rather than resolve the underlying dispute. The third scenario is that negotiations stall and pressure returns. If talks break down, military posture around Hormuz becomes more central again, and maritime enforcement would likely harden quickly. Reuters reports that the U.S. military is already setting conditions to clear mines and restore safer passage, which shows that operational planning is continuing alongside diplomacy, not after it. That means a breakdown would not return the situation to zero. It would shift the center of gravity back toward naval movement, deterrence, and rapid market reaction. So the answer viewers have stayed for is fairly simple. The best case path is a limited deal that reduces immediate pressure. The middle path is prolonged talks with only partial stabilization. The risk path is a failed negotiation followed by harder signaling around one of the world's most important energy choke points. Which path becomes real will depend less on the symbolism of the meeting and more on whether the parties can produce something practical on shipping, sanctions, and sequencing in the days ahead. What makes this story important is not only that U.S. and Iranian officials met in Pakistan. The bigger issue is whether diplomacy can stabilize a vital maritime choke point before military pressure and market stress take over again. Right now, the talks in Islamabad are happening under a fragile ceasefire, while the Strait of Hormuz remains the central strategic issue in the crisis. So the real measure of success is not the meeting itself or the symbolism around it. It is whether commercial traffic keeps moving through Hormuz, whether the risk premium in energy and shipping markets begins to ease, and whether both sides stay engaged long enough to turn a short pause into a more durable framework. Current reporting suggests there has been some limited tanker movement and active U.S. mine-clearing preparation, but it also suggests that confidence is still fragile, and the wider diplomatic gap remains significant. In other words, this is a test of whether diplomacy can produce practical stability before escalation regains momentum. If ships move more normally, prices begin to settle, and the talks continue, that would suggest the crisis is entering a more controlled phase. If not, the pressure will shift back toward deterrence, naval posture, and renewed uncertainty across the region and global energy markets. Subscribe for clear breakdowns on military news and geopolitics.